Welcome to the Bible Made Clear. So we have been going through this series on the Pentateuch. We've talked about Genesis, Exodus. We're going to kick off this session with Leviticus. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to get a high-level overview of the first 5 books of Moses, which is called the Mosaic Law, the Pentateuch. A lot of terminology that's different, meaning the same thing. It's the 5 books of Moses. And the reason it's important to understand it is because the rest of the Old Testament will refer back to it. It sets the foundation for Israel's covenant under the Mosaic Law, and it also lays the foundation for the New Testament. Now, obviously, it is not the New Testament. However, we need to understand the law because much of the New Testament quotes from the law in order to validate and substantiate what they are teaching, what the writers of the New Testament are giving us. So a crucial understanding of the Old Testament is really essential if you want to understand the Bible well. And you can read the New Testament alone and have a pretty good understanding of things, but the problem is you can also read into the Old Testament quotes because you may assume certain things and you may not really understand why the author is quoting the Old Testament or why they are quoting the Old Testament the way that they are quoting the Old Testament. In other words, how they are using it. So this series is designed to help to provide enough of an understanding, obviously without going into a very detailed verse-by-verse analysis of what the 5 books are really providing, okay? So in Leviticus here, which is the next book, it really deals with the sanctification of a nation. What's interesting is at the end of Exodus, Moses could not enter the tabernacle because of the presence of God. The cloud had come down, it had filled the tabernacle. God's glory was so overwhelming, but God was there, but Moses couldn't enter in. What ended up happening was by the end of the book of Leviticus, in the beginning of Numbers, they're able to enter in. Why is that? Because God gave them the prescribed way to do that through the book of Leviticus. And it's important for us to understand exactly why. Because God is holy and we are sinners, and God is going to prescribe specifically how the nation of Israel needs to have a relationship with this holy God. They couldn't stand in his presence. Paul in the New Testament tells us when he writes to Timothy, God dwells in unapproachable light. And also, we need to understand that, God is not the man upstairs or the big guy or whatever. Those are very disrespectful terms. I know how people use them. They may not mean them that way, but they are, because he's the creator. He's the Lord of heaven and earth. He holds our very life and breath in his hands. Next time I breathe out, I'll breathe in because he's allowing it. He's allowing the life in my body to continue. And so I need to understand that, that relationship exists. Now, for the Jews under the law, kind of like the sun. I mean, the sun is great, right? Gives us warmth, gives us light, reflects off the moon at night, gives us a little less light, but nonetheless, we appear, if you were to look at our solar system, they call it in the Goldilocks zone. We're right in the exact place we need to be in our Milky Way galaxy and also in our solar system. And, if you were to look at the planets in front of us, they actually block the light. So there's a narrow beam of light that filters through between them that hits the Earth. So everything is just kind of perfectly designed. So the sun, obviously, with its gravitational effect, we circle around it. That's how God had set it up to be. But at the same time, if you get too close to the sun, you'll burn up. So, not that God is the sun, S-U-N, but if you try to take a sinner and put them in God's presence, they won't survive. They can't survive. Not because of anything other than the fact that sin and corruption cannot dwell in God's presence. Okay, the power of God would overwhelm them, and it just would not be possible. So the nation needs to be able to approach God, and so God is giving them the prescribed method of doing that so that they can approach as sinners and not be destroyed. Okay, so as we go through here, we're looking at the sanctification of a nation, approaching God and maintaining fellowship. So Leviticus, all the procedures here are not to save people. These procedures are given to saved people, right? Not to redeem them, but to the redeemed, which is the nation that was redeemed by blood coming out of Egypt. So there are 5 sacrifices. We see that in the first 7 chapters, right? The burnt offering, fellowship offering, peace offering, sin offering, and trespass offering. So we'll get into those in more detail. Approach to the holy God only by the prescribed method, and God prescribes the method. We don't. In pagan religions, people kind of make it up and they try to figure it out and all that, and it's a balance between the false god and the people, and because obviously the false god doesn't really exist, so somebody had to make it up as they went along, but or take the method that God provides and then just pervert it. But the approach is a method prescribed by God. People don't determine how they have a relationship with God. God makes that determination, right? So in chapters 8 to 10, we have the institution of the Aaronic priesthood. Now, Aaron, who is Moses' brother, and his offspring are the only ones allowed to be high priests and offer sacrifices. So the other families of the Levitical tribe, they had other functions in relation to the tabernacle, but did not offer sacrifices. So not every Levite was a priest, which is why you'll see in the Old Testament oftentimes it'll say the Levites and the priests. Years ago when I first started reading the Bible, I was thinking, well, aren't the Levites the priests? There are, all priests are Levites, but not all Levites are priests. The priests are within Aaron's family, within the Levitical tribe. Okay. So then in chapter 11 to 15, we deal with laws specific to ritual cleanliness. And this is ritual cleanliness. It doesn't necessarily always mean that the person was like physically contaminated, okay? But oftentimes it's a ritual because it's dealing with a person's particular status, in a sense, as they're relating to God. Much of what we do is sinful, okay? Our hearts are sinful. Our ways are sinful. We can't help it. We're sinners. When we get to the sin offering and trespass offering, that point is made. They're mandatory offerings. The other ones are not. The other 3. So oftentimes, like if somebody touches a dead body, that was they were ritually unclean, ceremonially unclean. So they had to go through a ritual. They had to be put outside of the camp for a bit, and then they could come back in and be with everybody else. But oftentimes the ritual or the ceremonial things that were done were to teach the Jews and for us to understand, to learn based on what God taught them, that there are certain things that God considers sinful or corrupt for certain reasons. When things like deal with death, like animals that eat dead things and all that, scavengers, they were unclean animals, okay? Now, could they pick up a bacteria because they're eating something that's just dead? They're scavengers? Sure. But their systems are designed to accommodate that. However, because they were dealing with death, that creates the ceremonial uncleanness because God is a God of life. Now, people may die in this world in relation to the people in this world, but nobody dies in relation to God because God deals with them even after this life, whether they go to heaven or hell. They don't enjoy his presence and the benefits of everything that he offers if they are in hell or eternal fire. But the people that go to heaven do. So there's a distinction that has to be made in Leviticus, and though we're not reading through it, as you would read through it, you'd kind of, as an overall, see that God is trying to make the point that he's a God of life and light, and sin and corruption is separate from him. That's why he's holy. Holy means that God is separate. He's holy. He's separate, which is really what the word means, from the corruption that exists, right? So the cleansing of these ceremonially unclean people or things had to be cleansed, again, through a prescribed method. Everything was as God needed it to be done so that they could be safe or deal, or use it again, or the people could be back in fellowship again. We get to the middle of the book, and it's the Day of Atonement. That's chapter 16 and 17. That was the one day a year that the high priest would go into the Holy of Holies, where the Indiana Jones box was. They would take the blood in from the sacrifice that was offered. They would mix, around with a hyssop bush and sprinkle it on the top of the box. On the top of the box, it was called the mercy seat. It's where God's justice met with his mercy. In other words, God allowed the blood that was on the top of the ark. Now remember, the 10 Commandments are inside. So in a sense, he's allowing the blood to shield his view. Not that he couldn't see through it, but trying to help you metaphorically, shield his view from the fact that the commandments inside have been broken. So if the 10 Commandments on the inside are broken, he needs to judge them. But the judgment could be forestalled. In other words, it didn't need to take place. That's what mercy is. You deserve judgment, but God doesn't bring judgment. There's something that atones for you, right? And so that's what happens on the Day of Atonement. And that was for the entire nation. So basically, in a sense, the moral clock every year is reset. The nation starts off again, kind of with a clean slate. They go through their sacrifices on a daily basis throughout the year so that people can have fellowship with God. They bring their animals and whatever. And then at the end of the year, everything gets wiped. And then they get a restart as long as the high priest performs his function properly according to the prescribed method. So they offer a sacrifice for the nation once a year by only the high priest. There's only one high priest, right? And then the laws for the people's purity is in chapter 18 to 20. And those are specific laws to address holiness and purity among the people. And, I know a lot of times unbelievers pick on Leviticus 18 because it deals with improper sexual relationships. For example, if we look here, you can, I don't know if you can actually see it at the top of the New King James. I don't know if we can actually, maybe I can bring it down. See, it says unlawful sexual relations. That's the heading, right? So that's and that's really what it ends up being. It talks about people that you cannot have an improper intimacy with. People within your family. Um, y- you know, and you can read this on your own, but you can't have a relationship with people of the same sex, right? With animals. Now, you sit there and you say, oh my goodness, like, why does God even have to tell them something that awful? Well, the reason is because the pagans in the land of Canaan were doing that. They were practicing, um, there was a lot of homosexuality, there was bestiality. This is part of pagan worship. Pagan worship is basically an out of control sexual orgy at its root. And then from that, other things stem. I mean, you get unwanted children, you get venereal diseases. A lot of the venereal diseases we have come from abnormal sexual relationships with, beings that people are not made to have sex with. And syphilis comes from sheep. Okay. How's that getting into the human population? Well, that's how it happens, right? And so there's a lot of sexual perversion in paganism. It's really, the whole thing is interwoven with perverted sex. And then it's through that, like I say, you get unwanted children, then you got to sacrifice the children. And, people have power over others. And, there's human sacrifice, rape scenes, all this just crazy stuff. Things that are filthy, which, to be honest with you, is a whole subculture that exists in the world today that most Christians are insulated from. And thank God that we are, because it's filthy. Okay. It's filthy. It's detestable. And honestly, we would be sickened by it if we saw it. So, but God needed to let these people know before they went into the land of Canaan, I can't have you involved in this. This is the stuff that's getting these people moved out of the land. I'll move you out if you do the same thing. So important to understand. I know that people kind of joke about Leviticus, that it's, tough to read and everything. Actually, it's pretty straightforward. I think it's really insightful. As a matter of fact, I like Henry Kellogg, who did a commentary on it, well over 100 years ago. He did a great job. I think it's got a lot of good insights in it and everything else, but there's not a lot of good commentaries in Leviticus, kind of just dedicated to that book. So as we continue, there is laws for the priests, holiness and purity. So so as you can see here, the people's purity is laid out, and then the priests. And again, specific rituals for the priests to follow in their duties. They had to be cleansed because they're sinners before they actually perform their own duties, right? In chapter 23, we have the Sabbaths laid out and the 7 feasts. So there's 5 sacrifices and 7 feasts. And instructions as to when each feast was to occur. Essentially, you have 4 feasts in the spring, right? it kicks off with unleavened bread and Passover. So unleavened bread is a week-long feast. In the Gospels, oftentimes Passover will be mentioned as unleavened bread because the Passover is eaten on the first night of unleavened bread. So, they always coincide together. And then you have, Pentecost, which is 50 days after the senior moment. I just mentioned it after Passover, and and so with the different spring and fall feasts, like in the fall, it kicks off with trumpets. Oh, and the fourth feast, obviously in the springtime, is first fruits, right? The first fruits are offered at that time with the wave loaves and everything. So in the spring, you have the Feast of Trumpets that kicks it. I mean, in the fall, trumpets kicks it off. And then you have the Day of Atonement. And then after the Day of Atonement, you have the Feast of Tabernacles, where basically the Jews live outside for a week in remembrance of God caring for them when they lived in the wilderness with, no house. All right. So they lived in a tent. People would sleep on their roofs, the backyards, whatever, in remembrance of that. And then in chapter 24, we have the management of the lamps and the showbread. Those were obviously the priest duties within the holy place, and punishment for people that blaspheme. In chapter 25, the Sabbath year and the year of Jubilee, they are explained there. The resting of the land, freeing of slaves, and freeing the nation. Now, the year of Jubilee is the 50th year, okay? That's when all the clocks, in a sense, get reset. Debts are gone, so the financial, balance gets all reset back to zero, and everybody starts from scratch. Slaves are freed and everything else. Well, every 7 years, they had to rest the land, all right? So the 7th year, they were not supposed to do farming. Now, we find out that there's an actual, there's an agricultural reason for that, and that is because it allows a year for the nutrients in the soil to be enriched, okay? One of the problems we have today is we've so over-farmed in places that, you may be getting certain fruits and vegetables, but the nutrients in them are lacking and very poor. So, it's like, for your body, it's more like eating cardboard because they're not getting the same nutrition out of it because they've been basically extracted from the soil from over-farming, and then they make these genetically modified seeds so that they can grow faster and shorten the cycle so they can get it to market and sell more. And this is not good for everybody. I'm not talking whether you think GMOs are healthy or not. That's not my point. But the goal is to get more food to market, to make money, and blah, blah, blah. It's the same thing with overfishing. I mean, if you overfish an area, you end up with no fish eventually. I worked on a lobster boat as a kid out of Boston. And, we never had an issue at that time, but I know, the last probably 20, 25 years, especially, I know they've had issues with, how many lobsters they're going to catch and what the season is and all this other stuff. And they start limiting the lobstermen. They get angry and, they're trying to put food on their table. At the same time, they're trying to prevent the fishing industry from dying altogether. I do remember when I worked on the lobster boat that it was, I think, a $500 fine. This was back in like the 70s, okay? I was a kid. And in the late 70s, if you um, got a lobster in the trap that was a female that was pregnant, they had, you'd look at the under the tail, and it would look like caviar. It was all these eggs, thousands of them, right? And so, you're supposed to just throw that lobster back. Now, some lobstermen would risk the $500 fine, which is a big fine in the 70s, and they would, brush all the eggs off. Well, they're killing their own industry if they do that. Like, for the sake of one lobster, that they're going to get a couple of bucks for at the most, because, off the boat, it's huge, wholesale price, right? For the sake of that one lobster, they're killing thousands of lobsters. So, you do that, enough guys do that over time, you kill the industry. So there are practical reasons for, doing things to aid us so that we can continue to either grow or fish right. Now, the resting of the land was supposed to be once every 7 years. Israel ignored that for 490 years, and God got those 70 years of Sabbaths back when he sent them to Babylon. Every 7 years, servants were freed. Now, the Old Testament will call them slaves. Technically, they're really, they have a work contract. So many times, as a matter of fact, I was just having a conversation with Herb Butterworth on this today, because so many times people are confused. They think that slavery in the Bible is equal to American slavery. In the Old Testament, slavery was not that. Like, people did not own people. American slavery, interesting, tomorrow is Juneteenth, right? But American slavery was only made, it was enabled because of the Muslim slave trade. The Muslims started the African slave trade. They ended up providing slaves and selling them to people in the South to work on plantations and everything else. And they were good and bad slave owners. So again, these people, not of their own free will, were brought to the United States to be slaves, and they were actually owned, right, by their masters or the plantation owners or farmer owners or whatever, and so some of these slaves were treated well, some of them were mistreated. It really depended upon the owner, but they supplied everything for them, place to live, the food, welfare, for whatever they needed and everything. And then they worked the plantation, but that's kind of where they had to live. They were isolated to that. They didn't get set free other than when the Republican Party began. A little bit of American history, right? So Abraham Lincoln creates the Republican Party because it was only the Democratic Party. What people don't actually know, and I don't know how they don't know this, but the Democratic Party is actually the party of slavery. The Democrats always had slaves. The Democrats wanted to have slaves, and they were angry at the creation of the Republican Party to offset that. And, so the Civil War, obviously much of that was due to the fact that the United States was not going to have slavery. It was wrong. And so the Republican Party did not want the slaves. People needed to be freed. The Democratic Party wanted the slaves. Now, ironically, and then I'll get off this, but ironically, it seems like the Democratic Party still wants slaves because they're the ones that want to give all the handouts for welfare. Now, I know that welfare is a necessity in any nation that has any moral sense about them should help people in need. All right. There's no question about that. The problem with the welfare system that the United States has set up is that it enables people to not work. Okay. In other words, it provides them benefits and they don't have to work for it. They get a check in the mail. They do whatever they do. Okay. And what that does is that creates, if people get on there and then, there are, generational kind of slave families that they learn how to work the welfare system and then they stay on it. And the problem is they become a slave to the government because whatever the government says they will do, because if they don't do it, they lose their income. People that work for a living and people that are business owners or work for business owners, they oftentimes are not Democrats because they realize that, hey, I want to work for my own, my own stuff, whatever I'm doing. And then it's mine. And if I want to give it away, I can. If I want to be generous, I can. But I've worked for that and I am responsible for myself. Well, the problem is if the government comes in and says, we want you to do this, they can easily say, well, wait a minute, that's not right. That's either unconstitutional, that violates my civil rights, or, one of the amendments that I have as an American citizen or whatever. But people that are getting paid by the government to survive, they don't want to fight that. Okay. And so it takes their voice away and they become slaves. And that's really unfortunate. It's a different slave system. However, in the Bible, the slaves were actually, they were kind of under contract. If I had a farm that wasn't making money, or if I, needed more help to work the farm and I couldn't get it or whatever, I could go to a neighbor and say, listen, there's still 4 more years till the sabbatic year, in this cycle of sevens. And, for these 4 years, do you think I can get paid this amount of money? And then you negotiate and the guy would say, well, okay, I got to release you in 4 years. I could probably pay you this much. Can you survive on that? And yeah, I think I can do that. Okay, deal, right? So you kind of have that contract with them. You work their farm or do what they do, and then you save your own farm, and then you get released. And if you can then kind of start your own up again and get it going, then you don't need to keep working for that guy. But these were choices that people made. The times that they didn't have a choice was when, a farmer may be in that situation where he needs more income and he has kids that are old enough, and he may actually, it may be termed sell his kids into slavery, but what he was basically doing, he was saying, hey, Johnny, you got a job coming up. The people next door, you're going to be working over there. They're going to be paying you this much money because that's going to come back and help us in our farm. And so, Johnny would go to work for them or whatever. He'd be released at the 7th year or however far into the 7-year cycle he was. But that's how the slavery worked. They didn't own the people. If a foreigner came in from another country and converted to Judaism, they would have no land, okay? Because when Joshua went into the land initially, all the tribes were allotted an amount of land based on the number of people, which is why it's important that they knew how many people were in each tribe. And so they were given a land area. Well, that was passed on to their kids. That was their kids' inheritance. And so, if your dad was a farmer, then chances are you would be a farmer and your kids would be farmers. And, it wasn't like you went to the big city and got a job. Okay. Your job was like working in whatever the family had. Okay. And, you could be a shepherd or whatever. But what ended up happening is that if you came from another country, you didn't have land. You didn't have any inheritance. You basically came in either with nothing or whatever you left your country with, but that's only going to last so long. So you had to find somebody that would hire you as a servant. And again, the same rules apply. You could be released every 7 years, but oftentimes they didn't release because they really had no other options. Okay. It wasn't like, they could start climbing the corporate ladder somewhere. And some of these workers, servants, slaves, whatever you want to call them, they had great relationships with the people that they work for. And the ones that really wanted to stay, in other words, they didn't want to keep leaving after 7 years or whatever, sometimes they would have married another slave, right, if you will, start a family or whatever, and say, hey, listen, you treat me so well. Why would I want a job anywhere else? It's almost like this is the best career move I could have made. So what they would do is they would take that servant or whatever. And again, these are used as messianic verses for Christ. Okay. It's quoted in Hebrews, but they would take him to the, like the door of a barn, right? Put his ear up against it and take an awl. I don't know if you know what an awl is. An awl is, think of a screwdriver that you sharpen to a point, okay? They use awls a lot, to make holes in leather and stuff like that. But they would take an awl. You talk about having your ear pierced, right? Put it up against your ear, hammer it through, and then they would put some kind of ring or something in their ear to indicate that they were willingly a continual servant to whatever master it was. And they allowed themselves, in a sense, to be owned, okay? Which obligated the master to care for them under the law, right? Because all these laws that the Jews had were very specific. And it also obligated the servant to certain rules and criteria that they needed to follow also. So, the law was so much more than just like the Ten Commandments, So the year of Jubilee really was freeing the nation, in a sense, every 50 years. And some of that was kind of metaphorical in the Feast of Pentecost, the 50 years, right? Ironically, or actually, I guess prophetically in a sense, the church started on Pentecost. And that was what? That was the 50th year, the year of freedom, right? For the nation of Israel, freed in Christ. What a great opportunity, though obviously many rejected him. So I think I keep digressing, but we got to get through this. Promises and warnings in chapter 26, right? Covenant conditions for blessings, warning against, contempt, right? Disagreements, laws concerning commitments, laws for vows and tithing. There were actually 3 tithes in the Old Testament. The first one was to support, 10% was to support the Levites. And then out of what they got, they gave 10% to the high priest. So he made more money than everybody, in a sense. A lot of it wasn't necessarily money. And then the second tithe supported the temple when they got to that place where they built one. And then a third tithe was, it was once every 3 years. And what that was kind of a welfare package for strangers and, people that were maybe widows and orphans that found themselves destitute because, the way things were set up. I mean, if you lost your parents and you were a little kid, like they didn't have you didn't go to the state office and become a ward of the state and they try to find foster care for you. Like you were like nobody was there to care for you unless somebody took you in. Same thing as a widow. A widow, maybe an older woman could lose her husband. She may not be able to work the farm anymore or do anything and just, can't move around that well because of her age, and like who was going to care for her? Maybe she didn't have kids. Maybe the family was unable to do it. Whatever the circumstances were, there were widows and orphans. They were the most vulnerable people in the society, along with people that came in from other countries. It came in. They had to come in right, by the way. Israel did have borders, and when they came in, they would basically use this, tithe that came in basically a third or 1/10 every 3 years to help them. Now, so really in the Old Testament, you talk about tithing, they gave like 23%. People oftentimes don't realize that. They think it was just a 10%, but the first tithe was a tax. It wasn't like, oh, I'm giving because I love the Lord. I mean, hopefully they did, but they gave because they had to. It was part of the law. Like it was a legal requirement, right? It was a commandment. So they had to give 10%, and then, like I say, the other 10 and 10% every 3 years. So 23% a year basically is what they had to give. All right, now let's look at a kind of a chiastic, they call it. It's a technical term, but a balanced layout of the chapters. So we have rituals and sacrifices and feasts, right? The rituals are seen in the sacrifices and feasts. We then have the priesthood with their laws and ceremonies. We have purity laws and ceremonies for people, right? And priests. And this is how it lays out. Isn't it interesting? You have the sacrifices in the first 7 chapters, and then you have the feasts described in the last 4. I mean, it's like bookends, right? Then you have 8 to 10 with the priesthood. You get their laws, and then you get their ceremonies, right? They balance out again. And you can see this as you go through the book of Leviticus. Looking at it like this helps you see the chapters differently. It doesn't just become law after law. They are under headings, and they make sense, right? Purity for the people, right? And then the priests. And then what's in the middle? You get the Day of Atonement. And that's chapter 16 and 17. Really does, like, this is a great view to look at the book and realize, like, how it matches and balances in its chapters. So in the first, 15 chapters, it's really dealing with a lot of sacrifice, like the first 7, obviously. And that is, we approach God through sacrifice. And again, this was the nation for sanctification. All right. And then the feasts, really on the latter end, in the second half, that is how they abided in God. They remembered what God had done, right? Unleavened bread, Passover, Pentecost, first fruits, right? And then you get to the fall feasts and you get trumpets, the Day of Atonement, and then the Feast of Tabernacles. So interesting. Now, looking at the sacrifices, these are for sanctification. The 5 offerings in the first 7 chapters was Israel's approach to God to get right with God, right? So we'll look at the offering, whether they had a choice, and the reason for it. So you have the burnt offering. It was an animal, right, that was used in it. It was voluntary, and it spoke of total consecration. All these speak about Christ, every single one of them. They look forward to and are an aspect of what his ultimate sacrifice was. The second was the grain offering, or sometimes called the thanks offering. The reason was Thanksgiving. It was voluntary. Usually these 2 first ones were together. Sometimes the second one was called a worship offering, because when you offered the animal, you also offered the little cake made of grain that you offered in a way to say thank you. Because if you're consecrating yourself and offering a burnt offering, then the Thanksgiving offering was a way to complete your worship. Thank you, Lord, for who you are and everything that you've done and all that. And I just want to consecrate myself to you. I want to be devoted to you, right? Then you had the peace offering. Again, it was an animal, it was voluntary, and that was for fellowship. Lord, I just want to tell you how much I appreciate you. I appreciate, that I'm in the nation, that you've given me this opportunity to know you and blah, blah, blah. And I want to have good fellowship with you. I want to walk with you, right? The sin offering, again, was an animal. It was mandatory. Everybody had to, whether they wanted to or not voluntary. And it spoke of the fact of sin. Man has a sin nature, that's a fact. And this was a mandatory offering for sin, okay? Now, trespass offering was an animal also. It was also mandatory, but this was for the act of sin, right? Man's trespasses. So when I violated the law, sometimes I would do it unintentionally, many times intentionally. Well, then I needed to offer a trespass offering, okay? Because I had trespassed. You draw a line in the sand, say, don't walk over that line, and then you walk over the line defiantly. Well, that's trespass, okay? And sometimes people did that. They trespassed the law or whatever because they didn't realize it, okay? And then they realized it afterwards or whatever. But either way, they were mandatory. The 7 feasts are to stay right with God, to remember, right? I'm offering sacrifices to get right with God, kind of like 1 John 1:9. If we confess our sins, he's faithful and just to forgive us for our sins and cleanse us from all unrighteousness. Well, that's for the believer, not the unbeliever. That's for getting right with God. I'm not getting saved again. If my fellowship is broken because of sin, I'm admitting my sin before God, and then going to him and allowing him to cleanse me. I have to confess it. I have to, basically agree with God that, yeah, this is sin. I did it. I was wrong. I need forgiveness. So that would bring me back into fellowship as a Christian. Well, that's what these 5 offerings did, right? They brought people into fellowship with God. The feasts are to keep you there, to remind you throughout the year, right? So we have the Passover, a spring feast. It speaks of the death of Christ, obviously. And like the reasons above, Christ is totally consecrated to the Father. He worshiped him, he, gave thanks. He was in fellowship with him. He paid for our sins. That's how he is typified in the sin and trespass offering. He paid for our sins. He became sin for us that we may become the righteousness of God in him, right? The end of 2 Corinthians 5. The unleavened bread, that also happened in the spring, speaks of the sinless life of Christ. Leaven is always indicating of corruption or sin. It is never used in a good way. I know some commentators try to make it like that in the Sermon on the Mount, when Jesus talks about, the parables, the parables in Matthew 13, when Jesus gives the parable about the leaven and the woman that mixed the leaven in with the bread and everything, and it spread throughout. They say, oh, that's the gospel spreading. No, that's the spreading of sin among the believers, because it is always the metaphorical usages are consistent unless they're specifically changed. First fruits, again, in the spring, speaks of the resurrection, the offering of the first fruits, right? They gave the best that came up initially as basically making a statement that I believe God's going to bless the rest of my crop. Here's the first to you, Lord. And the best is always the first. Christ, right? 1 Corinthians 15, Christ is the first fruits of the resurrection, and everybody else in their own course. And then Pentecost, 50 days after, speaks of the Spirit's descent, a new beginning with the freedom on that, in the sense that 50th day, or metaphorically like the year of Jubilee, right? In the fall, trumpets kicked it off, speaks of Israel's regathering. Some people like to say that it's the rapture. It's not. They are related to Israel. Atonement, Yom Kippur, again, after it, of national cleansing. And then the tabernacles speaks of the Messianic kingdom and the rest that would come through the Messiah. So this is how it lays out. Again, I think that, this is helpful to see in kind of this chart form, if you will. And we are at 50 minutes, so took longer than I thought. I thought I would get it done much quicker, quite frankly, but hopefully you stayed with me until this point. But next time we'll pick up on Numbers. Hopefully the next time you read Leviticus, you realize it actually is an exciting book. It really, really speaks so much of what Christ has done for us. Everything he is woven in and out of. And listen, when you read the laws, as you go through Leviticus and you read the laws, realize that God put them there for their sanctification. Everything there is to remove them from the corruption that exists to get closer to God. Not physically closer, but to get closer into fellowship, grow in their spiritual maturity. Everything was designed to develop a good relationship with God. And as you read through everything, you realize that's why it's put there. It tells them exactly what to do. No guesswork. Okay? So, all right, until next time, may God richly bless you as you continue to study his word.